Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel MR.Creepy N. So today's video is definitely going to creep you out. In this video, we're getting into some deeply unsettling experiences that happen during the coldest, darkest nights of late winter. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. If you enjoy this kind of content, make sure to like the video and subscribe. Alright, let's get into tonight's stories. This happened 3 years ago, in late February. I was house sitting for my aunt while she visited my cousin in another state. Her place was about 40 minutes outside the city, one of those older farmhouses surrounded by empty fields and woods. The house sat on about 15 acres, most of it just overgrown forest that nobody maintained. I'd stayed there before during summers when I was younger, but never in winter, never alone. The first 2 nights were completely fine. I worked remotely during the day, video calls and emails, nothing too demanding. In the evenings, I'd make dinner and watch movies on her old TV. The house had this oil furnace that made clicking sounds throughout the night, but after the first evening, I got used to it. It became background noise. On the 3rd night, I was heating up leftover pasta around 8:30 when I remembered something my aunt had mentioned before she left. She'd asked me to check the mailbox every day because she was expecting some important documents. I'd completely forgotten about it for 3 days straight. I looked out the kitchen window. It was already pitch black outside, and the temperature dropped significantly. I could see my breath fogging up the glass, but I figured I should probably check it before I forgot again. I put on my heavy coat and boots and grabbed a flashlight from the drawer. The mailbox sat at the end of her long gravel driveway, maybe 200 feet from the house. In summer, it was a nice walk. In late February, with snow on the ground and wind cutting through the trees, it felt much longer. I stepped off the porch, and immediately the motion sensor light clicked on, illuminating the first 30 feet or so. After that, darkness. The snow crunched under my feet as I walked. There were no street lights out here, nothing except the fading glow of the porch light behind me getting dimmer with each step. I kept the flashlight pointed at the ground, watching my footing on the icy patches. When I finally reached the mailbox, I noticed something odd right away. There was a small piece of fabric tied around the metal post. It looked like a torn strip of red flannel, knotted tight around the base. I pulled it off, examining it in the flashlight beam. It was dirty and weathered, like it had been there for a while. I stuffed it in my pocket and opened the mailbox door. Inside were just some catalogs and a utility bill. Nothing important. I grabbed them and closed the metal door, the sound echoing in the quiet night. As I turned back toward the house, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a figure standing near the tree line about 50 yards to my left. They were completely still, just standing there in the snow between 2 large pine trees. I couldn't make out any features or details, just a dark, human-shaped silhouette against the slightly lighter snow. My first thought was that it might be a neighbor, but my aunt's nearest neighbor was over a mile away, and why would anyone be standing in the woods at night in the freezing cold? I started walking back toward the house, faster than I'd come. I kept glancing over my shoulder. The figure hadn't moved. It just stood there, watching me. My heart was pounding as I reached the porch. I fumbled with the door handle, finally got it open, and practically threw myself inside. I locked the deadbolt immediately. For the next 10 minutes, I stood at the kitchen window with all the lights off, staring out into the darkness. I couldn't see the figure anymore. Just the empty driveway and the black tree line beyond. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, maybe just a trick of the shadows or a weirdly shaped tree stump I hadn't noticed before, but I knew what I'd seen. I didn't sleep well that night. Every sound the house made, every creak and groan of the old furnace put me on edge. The next morning, I forced myself to walk back out to the mailbox in daylight. I needed to see if I'd imagined things. The sun was out, and everything looked normal, almost peaceful. But when I got close to where I'd seen the figure, my stomach dropped. There were footprints in the snow, clear boot prints, larger than mine, leading from deeper in the woods to the exact spot where the figure had been standing. They stayed there for a bit, multiple impressions in one area, like someone had been standing there for a long time. Then the prints led back into the trees, disappearing into the dense forest. But that wasn't the worst part. When I looked at the mailbox post, There was another strip of red flannel tied around it. Same type of fabric, same knot. I know I'd removed the first one the night before. I had it in my coat pocket back at the house. Someone had come back and put another one there. My hands were shaking as I pulled it off. I went back inside immediately and called my aunt. When I described what I'd found, she went completely quiet for several seconds. Then her voice changed, became more serious. She told me that about 5 years ago, the property had a problem. Someone had been living in an old hunting cabin deep in the woods on her land. She didn't know about it for months until she started noticing things going missing from her shed. Tools mostly, some camping supplies. The police eventually found the person and removed them, but my aunt said she always worried they'd come back. She told me to call the sheriff's department right away. A deputy arrived about 45 minutes later. I showed him the flannel strips and took him to where the footprints were. He followed them into the woods while I waited by his patrol car. He was gone for almost 2 hours. When he finally came back, his expression had changed. He looked troubled. They'd found the old hunting cabin about half a mile into the forest. Someone had definitely been staying there recently. Inside were food wrappers, empty water bottles, a dirty sleeping bag, and a camping stove. But what disturbed the deputy most was what else they found. There was a large pile of red flannel fabric in the corner, torn into strips. Dozens of them, maybe over 100 pieces, all roughly the same size. And on the cabin wall, someone had written dates in black marker. The dates went back 3 weeks. Next to each date was a time, all between 8 p.m. and midnight. The deputy asked me what time I usually went to bed. When I told him around 11 p.m., he just nodded slowly. He said I should pack my things and leave. He wouldn't elaborate on why, just said they'd keep patrolling the area and searching for whoever it was. I didn't argue. I threw my stuff in my car and left within an hour. My aunt came home early with her husband 2 days later. She had someone go out and tear down that cabin completely. She also installed motion sensor lights all around the property and got a security system installed. She ended up selling the house 8 months later. She told me she couldn't sleep there anymore. She kept thinking about those dates written on the cabin wall, about someone watching her house every single night for weeks, writing down patterns, leaving markers, testing to see if anyone would notice. I still have that first strip of red flannel. I keep it in a drawer in my apartment. I don't know why I kept it. Maybe as a reminder of how close I came to something I still don't fully understand. Sometimes late at night when I hear a noise outside, I think about standing at that mailbox in the dark, about turning around and seeing that figure just watching me from the trees, about how many nights they'd been out there before I ever knew they existed. I used to work at a small veterinary clinic on the edge of town. This was last February during that strange stretch of weather, where we had almost a week of sub-zero temperatures, followed by a sudden warm spell, the kind of temperature swing that makes everything melt during the day and freeze solid again at night. It creates this awful icy slush everywhere that's somehow worse than regular snow. I was closing up alone on a Thursday night, around 10 p.m. We only had 3 animals boarding that week. 2 cats recovering from routine surgeries, and a German shepherd named Duke, whose owner was out of state for a funeral. It was supposed to be a quiet night. I'd just finished my final check on all of them, made sure they had water and were comfortable, when I heard something that made me stop. It was a scratching sound coming from the back of the building, specifically from the steel door that led to our outdoor waste area, where we kept the medical disposal bins and biohazard containers. The scratching was persistent, rhythmic, like something was trying to get in. I figured it was probably an animal trying to get warm. We'd had problems before with raccoons and stray cats getting into that area. I grabbed a flashlight from the office and walked to the back door. The scratching stopped as soon as I got close. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy door open. Nothing there, just the fenced waste area and those big red biohazard containers we use for medical waste. The security light above the door was burned out, so I used my flashlight to look around. Everything seemed normal at first. Then I noticed one of the container lids was open. That immediately bothered me, because I always made sure they were closed. It was clinic policy because of the smell and to prevent animals from getting into them. I stepped outside into the cold and walked over to shut it. That's when I saw the footprints. They were clearly visible in the melting slush around the containers, boot prints, human-sized, definitely not from an animal. Someone had been standing right there, right next to our medical waste. The prints led to the chain-link fence that enclosed the area, and I could see where someone had climbed over. There were fabric fibers caught on the top of the fence, little threads of dark material. My stomach dropped. I backed up slowly toward the door, my eyes scanning the area. Whoever had been here might still be close. I went back inside quickly and locked the door behind me, my heart racing now. I immediately started checking every room in the clinic, every closet, every examination room, the surgery area, even the storage spaces. Nothing seemed disturbed. All the animals were still secure in their kennels. But I felt exposed, vulnerable. The clinic suddenly felt too big, too many dark corners. I went to the front office, where we had our security camera monitor. We only had 2 cameras. One covered the front parking lot and entrance, and one covered the main hallway inside the building. I sat down and rewound the footage from the past hour, my hands shaking slightly as I worked the controls. At 9:47 p.m., while I had been in the surgery room cleaning instruments, something moved past the hallway camera. It was just for a second, barely visible, a shadow that came from the direction of the back door and moved toward the boarding area where we kept Duke and the cats. Someone had been inside the clinic. While I was here, they'd been in the building with me. I felt sick. My first instinct was to run out the front door, but I forced myself to stay calm. I pulled out my phone and called the police, keeping my voice low, even though I was probably alone now. I told them someone had broken into the veterinary clinic and might still be inside. They said officers were on the way. While I waited, Duke started barking from the back. It wasn't his normal bark. It was aggressive, alarmed. The cats joined in with stressed yowling sounds. Something had all of them agitated. The police arrived within 15 minutes, though it felt like hours. 2 officers came in and we searched the building together. They were thorough, checking every space I'd already checked. Everything looked normal until we got to the boarding area. Duke's kennel door was unlatched, not open, but the lock mechanism had been flicked to the unlocked position. He was still inside, pacing nervously, but that door could have been opened at any moment. One of the officers knelt down to examine it, while I tried to process what that meant. The other officer noticed something and called us over. The medication cabinet in the boarding area was open. We kept controlled substances in there, locked behind a key code system that only staff knew. The door was slightly ajar, the electronic lock disengaged. I immediately started checking the inventory, my mind racing through what drugs we had in there. Sedatives, painkillers, euthanasia solutions, thousands of dollars worth of controlled substances. But as I went through the list, nothing was missing. Every bottle and vial was accounted for. But there was something that shouldn't have been there. Sitting on the middle shelf, placed carefully between medication bottles, was a small plastic bag. Inside was a syringe, already filled with some kind of clear liquid. There was a piece of masking tape stuck to the bag with writing in black permanent marker. It said, "For Duke." The officer immediately bagged it as evidence, handling it carefully with gloves. He asked me to check the inventory again, specifically for sedatives. I went through it slowly this time, comparing bottle levels to our detailed logs. That's when I found it. One of our bottles of sedative was slightly less full than it should have been. Someone had drawn out approximately 15 milliliters. They'd done it carefully enough that I almost missed it. They had the syringe tested at the lab. It came back as a concentrated sedative dose that would have been lethal for a dog Duke's size. It would have killed him within minutes, made it look like his heart just stopped. The medical examiner said whoever prepared it knew exactly what they were doing. They had veterinary knowledge. The police pulled me aside and started asking about Duke's owner. I gave them all the information I had. His name was Marcus Horvath. He'd been a client for 3 years. Always paid on time. Loved that dog more than anything. Turns out Marcus was going through an extremely bitter divorce. His ex-wife had made threats about the dog. She'd said in text messages that she'd make sure he lost everything he cared about. But she had an alibi for that night. She was 3 states away at her lawyer's office, confirmed by security cameras and multiple witnesses. They investigated for weeks, but never figured out who broke in. The footage showed that shadow in the hallway, but the angle never caught her face or any identifying features. The boot prints outside led to the parking lot and then disappeared on the pavement. Marcus picked up Duke the next day. I had to tell him everything that happened. When I showed him the photos the police had taken of that syringe with his dog's name on it, he went completely pale. He sat down in one of our waiting room chairs and put his head in his hands. He asked me a question that I still think about. He said, "Did you check on the cats?" I told him yes, they were fine, completely unharmed. He looked at me and said, "That's the point. Whoever did this wanted me to know they could have killed Duke. They got past your security, got into your drugs, prepared a lethal injection, and unlocked his kennel. But they didn't do it. They wanted me to know they were that close. They wanted me to know they chose not to. This time, the clinic installed a complete security overhaul after that. More cameras, better locks, a proper alarm system, and a policy that no one closes alone anymore. But I quit about 2 months later. I couldn't stay there at night. Every sound made me think about that shadow moving through the hallway while I was in the surgery room, about someone standing in our medication area, carefully drawing up that syringe, writing Duke's name on the tape, about them standing over his kennel with the door unlatched, making a decision. Marcus told me a few months later that he dropped the divorce proceedings entirely. He gave his ex-wife most of what she wanted in the settlement. He said it wasn't worth fighting anymore. He said Duke was getting older, and he didn't want to spend whatever time they had left looking over his shoulder. I think about that sometimes, about how someone broke into our clinic in the middle of a cold February night, made their point without saying a single word, and disappeared like they were never there, and about how it worked exactly the way they wanted it to. In late February, 2 years ago, I moved into a rental house at the end of a dead-end road, about 20 minutes outside of town. I'd been looking for a place for almost 2 months, and everything in my budget was either horrible or already taken. When I found this listing, I jumped on it immediately. It was cheaper than anything else I'd seen, had decent space, and the landlord seemed normal enough during the showing. He mentioned during the walkthrough that the property backed up to about 40 acres of state forest land. He said it was quiet, peaceful, good for hiking, if I was into that. He was definitely right about the quiet part. The nearest neighbor was half a mile away, and the road didn't go anywhere except to my house and one other property that looked abandoned. The house itself was small, but decent for one person. 1 bedroom, a kitchen that was outdated but functional, a living room with old carpet, and an old oil heating system that rattled but kept the place warm. There was a back deck that looked out into the trees. The snow was still thick back there, completely untouched except for animal tracks crisscrossing through it. I'd been living there for about a week when I first saw the lights. It was past midnight on a Friday. I'd gotten up to use the bathroom and happened to glance out the small window that faced the back of the property. That's when I saw a flashlight beam moving through the trees. It was maybe 70 yards out, sweeping back and forth slowly, like someone was searching for something. I stood there, watching for maybe 5 minutes. The light moved in a methodical pattern, covering ground systematically. Then it just disappeared, clicked off completely. I figured it was probably someone hiking, or maybe a forest ranger checking the woods for some reason. It was a weird time to do it, but I didn't think much of it beyond that. 2 nights later, Sunday around 1 a.m., I saw it again. Same thing, a single flashlight moving through the trees behind my house. I was still up working on my laptop when I noticed the light through the living room window. This time, I was more curious. I put on my boots and heavy coat and stepped out onto the back deck. The cold hit me immediately. It had to be in the teens, and the wind cut right through my coat. I could see my breath in thick clouds. The flashlight was still moving out there, closer than before, maybe 50 yards into the trees. The moment I stepped outside, the light stopped moving. It just stayed in one spot, pointed at the ground. I stood there on my deck, trying to see if I could make out who was holding it, but it was too dark. The trees were too dense. Then the light tilted up. It pointed directly at me, right at my face. We stayed like that for what felt like a full minute, but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds. Me standing on my deck, that light shining directly at me from the woods. Then it went out. Complete darkness, just the sound of wind through the trees. I went back inside immediately and locked the door. My heart was pounding. Something about that moment felt wrong. It wasn't just someone hiking. They'd been watching me. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling. I needed to know what was going on. I put on my winter gear and walked into the woods to see if I could find any tracks or signs of who had been out there. The snow was disturbed in several places, boot prints going in different directions. They looked relatively fresh. But there was something else that caught my attention. About 40 yards into the trees, I found a piece of orange surveyor's tape tied around a tree trunk, the kind that land surveyors use to mark boundaries or points of interest. Then I found another one about 10 feet away on a different tree. Then another. I followed them. They made a line through the woods, roughly parallel to my house. Each piece of tape marked a tree, creating a visible path through the forest. I counted 17 pieces before I stopped following them. They seemed to go on indefinitely into the state forest. That night, I went online and started looking up property surveys. It took some searching, but I eventually found the official survey map for my rental property. The property line between the house lot and the state forest was clearly marked on the map. When I compared it to where I'd seen those orange tapes, my chest tightened. The tapes weren't on the state forest side. They were on the private property side, the side I was renting. Someone had marked a line through what was supposed to be the landlord's land, about 15 yards inside the actual property boundary. I called the landlord the next morning. I explained what I'd found, the lights in the woods and the surveyor tape. He sounded confused at first, then increasingly annoyed. He said nobody had permission to survey his property. He said he'd come check it out himself, but he lived almost 2 hours away and couldn't make it until the weekend. He told me not to worry about it, probably just kids messing around, but it didn't feel like kids messing around. That night, the lights came back, but this time, there weren't just one. There were 3 separate flashlights moving through the woods, and they were closer than they'd ever been, maybe 30 yards from my house. I didn't go outside this time. I turned off all my lights and watched from the window. The 3 beams moved in a coordinated pattern, sweeping the ground methodically. Every few minutes they'd stop and converge on a single spot, like they'd found something. I couldn't see what they were doing. After about 20 minutes, the lights would spread out again and continue the search pattern. This went on for over an hour. I watched the entire time, my phone in my hand, ready to call 911 if anyone approached the house. Finally, around 2:30 a.m., the lights disappeared back into the deeper woods. I barely slept that night. As soon as it was light enough to see, probably around 7 a.m., I made myself go back out there. I had to know what they'd been doing. There were fresh boot prints everywhere. Multiple sets, different sizes. At least 3 different people had been all over the area directly behind my house. And there were new orange tapes. These ones were much closer, marking trees just 15 yards from my back deck. Near one of the newly marked trees, I found something that made my blood run cold. Pushed into the snow at the base of the tree was a wooden survey stake, the kind with a pointed end that gets driven into the ground. On top of it, secured with a rubber band, was a handwritten note inside a clear plastic bag. The note said, "Disputed boundary. Stay einstein." I didn't even go back into the house to pack. I got in my car and drove straight to a motel in town. From there, I called the landlord and told him I was breaking the lease effective immediately. He started to argue, threatening to keep my security deposit and take me to small claims court. Then I sent him photos of everything, the survey tape, the boot prints, and especially that note. He went quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke again, his voice was different. He told me something he hadn't mentioned before. The property had been tied up in a legal dispute for 6 years. The previous owner had sold a section of the land to the state for the forest preserve, but there had been disagreements about where the actual boundary line was. The case was still in court. He'd thought it was basically resolved, that it was just paperwork at this point. Apparently it wasn't. He told me I should stay away from the property until everything was officially settled. Then he asked me a question that I still think about. He asked if the people in the woods had tried to contact me directly, if they'd knocked on the door or approached me. When I said no, he said I was lucky. He said the previous tenant, the person who'd lived there before me, had someone knock on their door at 3 a.m. one night. When they answered it, nobody was there. Just one of those wooden survey stakes driven straight through their welcome mat into the porch boards underneath. I never went back to get my stuff. The landlord eventually mailed me some of my belongings in a box a few weeks later. When I opened it, wrapped in newspaper at the bottom, was one of those orange surveyor tapes. I don't know if he put it there as some kind of joke, or if someone else had access to that box. I took it out to my apartment complex dumpster and threw it away. But sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I think about those lights moving through the trees, about people systematically marking territory in the dark, getting a little closer each night, about that note telling me to stay inside and how I never saw who left it there, about what might have happened if I'd ignored it. This happened last winter, when I was volunteering at an overnight warming station the city ran for homeless people during extreme cold. They opened these emergency stations on nights when the temperature dropped below 15 degrees. We used an old community center building that mostly sat empty during the winter months. A brick structure from the 1960s with a large main room and several smaller side rooms. My regular shift was 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. on Friday nights. Usually, we get anywhere from 8 to 15 people throughout the night, though the number varied depending on how cold it actually was and how much word it spread that we were open. My job was straightforward: check people in at the front desk, make sure everyone had blankets and access to hot coffee, and basically just keep an eye on things to make sure everything stayed calm and safe. There were always supposed to be 2 volunteers per shift for safety reasons, but my usual partner had called in sick that particular Friday night. My supervisor asked if I was comfortable working alone, and I said yes. I'd been doing this for almost 4 months by that point, and never had any real problems. People were usually just grateful to be out of the cold. By 1 a.m., boozed, most of our guests were settled in the main room, sleeping on the portable cots we'd set up. It was a quiet night. I was at the front desk doing some paperwork and inventory logs when the front door opened, bringing in a blast of freezing air. A man walked in, wearing a thick winter coat that was crusted with ice, like he'd been outside for hours. His face was bright red from the cold, and he was breathing heavily. I gave him the standard greeting and asked him to sign in on our log sheet, so we had a record of who was in the building. He stared down at the clipboard for a long moment without moving. His hands were shaking badly, though I couldn't tell if it was from the cold or something else. Finally, he picked up the pen and wrote something, but when I glanced at what he'd written, it was just scribbled loops and lines, completely unreadable. "I'm sorry, I didn't catch your first name," I said, trying to be helpful and not confrontational. He looked up at me with these completely bloodshot eyes, the whites turned pink from broken blood vessels. His expression was blank, emotionless. He said, "Doesn't matter what my name is." His voice was rough, strained. I didn't push the issue. Our policy was not to turn anyone away on cold nights unless they were actively violent or so intoxicated they posed a danger. He seemed sober, just off. Something about him made me uncomfortable, but I couldn't articulate exactly what it was. I showed him to an available cot in the back corner of the main room, away from where most of the other guests were sleeping. He walked slowly, his movements stiff. When he reached the cot, he sat down on it without taking off his coat. He just sat there, staring straight ahead at the blank wall. I went back to the front desk. About an hour passed. I did my routine walkthrough around 2 a.m. to check on everyone, make sure nobody needed anything. Most people were asleep, or at least lying down quietly. A few were awake, talking in low voices to each other. When I got to the back corner where I'd left the man in the ice-crusted coat, the cot was empty. His coat was still there, but he was gone. The coat was laid out flat on the cot, spread out carefully like someone had posed it deliberately. The arms were positioned straight out to the sides. I checked the bathrooms first, both empty. Then I checked the side rooms we used for storage and supplies. Nothing. Nobody. The front door had a bell attached to it that rang whenever someone opened it. I'd been sitting at the desk the entire time and I never heard that bell ring. I walked back to the main room and counted everyone as discreetly as I could. We should have had 12 people, including the man who just arrived. I counted 11. He was definitely gone, but his coat was still there on the cot. I picked up the coat to fold it properly, thinking maybe he'd gone outside briefly and would come back for it. That's when something fell out of the pocket and hit the floor with a metallic sound. It was a small silver locket, tarnished with age. I opened it carefully. Inside was a photo of a woman and 2 young children, maybe 6 and 8 years old, all smiling at the camera. On the opposite side of the locket was an engraved inscription that said, "Always come home, M." That's when I noticed something strange about the coat itself. I turned it over and looked at the inside lining. It was completely shredded, torn up like someone had been frantically digging through the fabric or clawing at it. And covering every inch of the inner lining was writing in black, permanent marker. Words and phrases were scrawled everywhere in desperate handwriting. "Not a real. The waiting. Don't sleep here. Check the basement. Check sleep here. Check the smind. Check's calling. Squalling. Scald cold. Cold." My hands went numb, and it had nothing to do with the temperature. I stood there, holding this coat covered in someone's deteriorating mental state, captured in frantic marker scribbles. I heard footsteps behind me and spun around fast. It was Teresa, one of our regular guests, an older woman in her 60s who came to the warming station several times each winter. She was standing about 10 feet away, looking at the coat in my hands. "Where did he go?" she asked quietly. "I don't know," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "Did you see him leave? Did he go out the front door?" She shook her head slowly. "I didn't see him leave, but I heard him. He was whispering to himself for a while, maybe 20 minutes. I couldn't make out most of it, but right before he stopped, he said something clear. He said, 'The ones downstairs finally answered me.' Then nothing. Complete silence. A chill ran down my spine. Downstairs. Teresa, this building doesn't have a basement. It's built on a concrete slab foundation. She just looked at me. I know that. But that's what he said. I went back to the front desk and checked the sign-in log again, trying to see what time he'd arrived according to my notes. I'd written down 1:17 a.m. as his check-in time. But when I looked at the actual clipboard where guests signed in, there was no entry after 12:40 a.m. The scribbled loops I'd watched him write weren't there. The page looked exactly like it had before he'd arrived. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone and called my supervisor. I explained the situation as calmly as I could. She told me to file an incident report, keep the coat in our lost and found in case he came back for it, and call her immediately if he returned or if anything else strange happened. I stayed at that front desk for the rest of the night, unable to focus on anything else. Every time the old building creaked or the wind rattled the windows, I jumped. I kept expecting to see that man walk back in through the front door, or worse, to see him emerge from one of the side rooms. At 6 a.m., Teresa came up to the desk with her belongings, getting ready to leave before the morning rush of people started. She asked if I'd figured out what happened to the man in the coat. I shook my head. No, nobody saw him leave. It's like he just vanished. She leaned in close, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "I've been coming to these warming stations for 3 years now," she said. "Different locations, but I know a lot of the regular volunteers and guests. Every winter, someone mentions him. A man who shows up on the absolute coldest nights wearing an ice-covered coat. He talks about a basement that doesn't exist. He asks if anyone's seen his family. Then he disappears, and his coat is always left behind." I felt my skin crawl. "Teresa, that's not funny. I'm not joking," she said seriously. "They say he's looking for his family. The story I heard is that he froze to death about 7 years ago, trying to find a warming shelter that had closed down. He was with his wife and kids. They say he's still looking for them, still trying to find a safe, warm place. But he never can, because he doesn't understand he's already gone." I wanted to tell her that was ridiculous, that I didn't believe in ghosts or spirits or any of that. But I couldn't explain what had happened. The man was there, and then he wasn't. No bell rang. The signature vanished from the log. I kept the coat and the locket. I tried to trace them, to find out who the family in the photo was. I spent hours searching missing persons databases, cold case files, and local news archives. Nothing matched. No reports of a man and his family freezing to death 7 years ago. No one ever came to clean the coat. I stopped volunteering after that night. I told my supervisor it was because my school schedule was getting too demanding, but that wasn't the real reason. I couldn't go back to that building. Couldn't sit at that desk wondering if the next person who walked through the door was actually alive. The community center stopped being used as a warming station the following year. The city opened a newer, better facility across town with more space and resources. But sometimes, on the coldest nights in late February, when the temperature drops and the wind howls, I think about that coat laid out on the cot with its arms spread wide, about those desperate words scribbled on the inside lining by someone whose grip on reality was slipping away, about a man still searching for a basement that never existed, looking for a family he can't find, walking through a cold that will never end. And I think about how I never heard that doorbell ring when he left, because maybe he never actually opened the door at all.